The number one mistake that I see new players making on the tennis court when they're hitting a forehand is they try to hit every forehand like this. The secret to getting a good forehand when you're starting out is actually to not try to hit like the pros do. Because if you try to hit like the pros do, it's a very complex swing, leads to a lot of inconsistency and control issues on the court, and you don't get to a point where you're able to actually win with that forehand for sometimes even many years. My name's Nate Gross. I'm a USPTA certified elite tennis coach and the founder of Spec Tennis. And today I'm going to show you how to hit a very functional forehand that's going to allow you to win a lot of matches and save you a lot of frustration on the tennis court. If you're a beginning player and you try to hit your forehand like this, you're probably going to miss more than you make. But instead, if you just hit your forehand like this, you're going to develop great control, the ability to manipulate the ball around the court, and really just outlast your opponents with consistency without putting in a lot of effort with the racket. You really don't need to hit like an A-level player to win at the C level, right? The less swing that I'm doing, the less that can go wrong. And the other things that are great about this shot is I'm hitting the ball very high, so I'm never gonna hit in the net, and I'm creating a very challenging ball for my opponent. What's important is not how you hit the ball, but the effect that it has on your opponent. And especially at the beginning levels, if you hit a high ball to your opponent, those are balls that they struggle with and often make a lot of errors on. Now with this simple block swing that I've been demonstrating, you also develop great defensive skills. I'll show you what that looks like. But essentially when you're under pressure, you're in a rush to get to the ball, you want to be able to play defense. Because if you can't, you lose the point. And so a lot of players come in, they only know how to do this swing, they can't play defense. They lose anytime they're under stress. Now you might be thinking at this stage, Nate, this block forehand that you showed me, it's not sexy. I don't see any other coaches teaching it on YouTube, in person, etc. And that's correct, but at the beginning and intermediate levels of tennis, you can't win and look sexy. You have to pick one or the other. But you want to know what's really sexy is you holding up that trophy at the end of the tournament that you just won with your non-sexy swing. So keep these things in mind, right? Later when you become more advanced, you can start looking good and winning. But too many players try to do this in the beginning stages and they just get absolutely destroyed in matches by players who look just like this. Now I'm going to take things even a step further and suggest that you learn the forehand with a Spec Tennis paddle first on the smaller court with a lower bouncing ball, and then you transition to the tennis racket using that exact same skill set. Now the benefit of starting with the paddle is number one, you get a lot of control. It's also a lot easier to find the sweet spot of the paddle since it's closer to your hand, and so this leads to a lot faster improvement. And I actually train my tennis players using this progression model where we start off with the Spec Tennis paddle, and then as they complete certain checkpoints, we move back further from the net and then eventually move to the tennis racket. And I'm 100% convinced that they improve a lot faster using this progression-based approach than if they simply use the tennis racket the whole time. Think about things in life like math. We don't learn how to multiply and divide before we learn how to add and subtract, right? And so tennis is just like that, right? I'm not going to learn the most complex swing in the game when I just have barely started playing tennis. I'm going to start off simple, and this tool of Spec Tennis, as you'll see, is going to make things a lot simpler. You'll have a lot more fun, a lot quicker success, and you'll be back at the baseline with a tennis racket in no time. So now I'm going to give you some things to focus on when learning the simple block forehand. Number one is you need a Continental Grip. If you don't know what that grip is, just practice bouncing the ball to yourself like this. You'll likely end up in a Continental Grip, because if your hand is too much underneath the paddle, you're going to have to bend your wrist. It's going to be very uncomfortable. So if your wrist feels uncomfortable, just rotate your hand until it's comfortable. You're likely in a Continental Grip. Same thing for a right-handed player. I just have the paddle in my right hand. So again, if I just bounce the ball to myself, the paddle's pointed up to the sky. I have a nice relaxed wrist, no tension here. Now I'm in a Continental Grip. And so this is the best grip for this shot because it enables us to get our paddle open, which means pointed up towards the sky without bending our wrist. The more open our paddle is, the easier it is to send the ball high, and typically the higher it goes, the further it also goes. So with very little effort, we can send the ball anywhere in the court, depending on how we hit it. The second thing you want to focus on is taking the paddle back with two hands on the paddle after you recognize that the ball is coming to your forehand. So what that means is I start like this. When I recognize it's going to be a forehand, I take the paddle back with two hands on the paddle because this helps me turn my shoulders. And if I turn my shoulders, I don't have to rely on just arming the ball. When I arm the ball, this leads to a lot of tennis elbow injuries and things like that, and also a lack of power. So let's nip that in the bud right away. Take the paddle back with 2 hands on the paddle, because that forces the shoulder turn and you're using more muscles to hit the ball versus just the arm. Now, once the paddle or racket has passed my back hip, now I can take this hand off the paddle if I want to, because most people like to hit a one-handed forehand. So here's how that looks, where I turn with 2 hands and I swing with 1. Just think turn 2, swing 1. And the final thing to keep in mind on this shot is I want to start lower than the ball, and I want to make impact with the bottom part of the tennis ball. Right? If you see a pro forehand, they're often hitting the back part of the tennis ball. That's not what we want for this simple block forehand. We actually want to hit the bottom part of the tennis ball. So again, the ball just goes up. We don't have to put in very much effort to get it over the net. So putting that all together, Continental Grip, I turn with 2 hands on the paddle, swing with 1, impacting the bottom part of the ball. And notice I'm not following through. I'm just stopping with my paddle right here. And the reason for that is because the follow through should be determined by what happens before that. So if you have a lot of momentum before you make contact with the ball, yes, you're going to need to follow through. Right? You see the pros, they're following through it on almost every shot. But on this swing, it's so simple and small, there's not a lot of momentum before that. And so the paddle just naturally goes here. Right? You don't want to try to force yourself to follow through. And in fact, if you do follow through with a paddle angle like this, you might actually send the ball over the fence. Now I'll quickly show you the same thing right-handed, just so you can see it in action both ways. If you're right-handed, same thing, finding that Continental Grip, just the grip where we're bouncing the ball up and down. And then we put our left hand on top of the paddle. Same thing, I'm going to turn with 2 hands, swing with 1, impacting the bottom part of the tennis ball. Here's a right-handed forehand example. Turn with 2, swing with 1, impacting the bottom of the ball. No follow through because I haven't generated enough momentum to warrant a follow through. Now, after you've got this down pat, it's not time to move on to the pro forehand yet. I have my players go through a series of progressions where they're expected to be able to do a 20-ball rally with me before they move on to the next progression. So simply just making the shot is good, but then they need to start being able to make it to a certain location or make it to a certain depth in the court or a certain height above the net, etc. And so that can take a while before they're able to achieve a 20-ball rally in each of these different scenarios. And then only then do I switch them to the tennis racket. And I'll often start them in the same place, so they don't need to be at the baseline with the tennis racket. Like we said before, we're going from simple to complex. And so if somebody doesn't have it down from here, there's no point in having them do it from back there because they're just going to keep failing over and over from back there and get frustrated. And so I'll do the same thing with the tennis racket, that same block swing, turn with 2, swing with 1, hit the bottom of the ball from the tennis service line right here. So I haven't moved back at all. Now I'm just trying to adapt to a little bit longer tool. But notice that I was using the same exact technique as I was doing with the Spec Tennis paddle, right? It's just a progression from one to the next, but no need to change anything. And so be sure to test yourself from various positions on the court, hitting various locations, depths, targets, before you move back eventually to the baseline with the tennis racket. And then do the same thing with the tennis racket at the baseline. There's no rush to get to the baseline or to get to a full swing like the pros. Remember, like I said earlier, you don't need to play at an A level to win at the C level, right? And so oftentimes the players that are the smartest are just doing just enough to win, and they're not making a lot of mistakes because their swings are so simple, they have a lot of control of the ball. Now remember, there should be no rush for you to move back to the baseline with the tennis racket. You want to get everything else down first so that you develop a really good foundation and a lot of control. But once you do get back to the baseline, same thing, same block forehand swing. And right-handed, same thing. There are actually 5 levels of a forehand or a backhand that I teach, with this one being number 1. The topspin forehand, the pro one that you see, where they actually hit the ball like this, That's number 5 in the progression of levels. And so you don't need to be hitting that one, especially when you're starting out playing tennis. And so that's how I recommend hitting a forehand, especially if you're a beginning player or new to tennis, is just really simplify it and get yourself a forehand that's going to allow you to actually win matches and play the sport and have fun with your friends, rather than trying to mimic the pros who have put thousands of hours and repetitions into their shots since the time they were little kids. Now, I also recommended, like I said earlier, training with the Spec Tennis paddle first, because it really simplifies everything. You automatically have a lot more control with the paddle than you do with the racket, and then you can switch back and forth because it's the same technique for both. So if you'd like more information about Spec Tennis, I'm putting some links down in the description. And if you really take this information to heart and show me that you have mastered this simple block forehand, then I'm happy to make the video of the pro topspin forehand as well. So just shoot me a note in the comments if you've mastered this and you would like me to make another video. Thanks, and we'll see you soon.